Earlier this year, Alberta Judge Robin Camp resigned from the bench after a national outcry. He was the judge, if you remember, who made headlines when he asked a 19-year-old sexual assault victim why she didn't just, quote, keep her knees together. Camp apologized, has undergone training and counseling, and now he wants to re-enter the legal system, this time as a lawyer. Later this morning, he will have a reinstatement hearing to determine if that's even possible. Joining us now with more is Tanya Walker from Walker Law. Good to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
All right, first of all, what will they be looking at in these hearings? What are they going to assess? And how will some of the comments that came out of that trial and eventually led to his resignation play into this hearing?
What they're going to look at is if he is capable of representing a client. Really, what they're looking at is or have you rehabilitated yourself? So the conclusion of his tenure as a judge, it was said that he destroyed the integrity, impartiality, and independence of the judicial system. So that's where they're starting off at. And now it's up to him to prove that he has really rehabilitated himself and that he is able to practice law.
What evidence can he bring that would show that he has rehabilitated, had a different viewpoint?
An example of this that happened a few years ago in Ontario was a law student who threatened condominium board members. He was charged with criminal harassment, uttering death threats just because of an increase in maintenance fees. And he was denied twice to practice law. And the third time around, he demonstrated that he volunteered, he made donations to the hospital for sick children, and also he had the evidence of a forensic psychiatrist. So at that point, it was decided, okay, he has rehabilitated himself and he should be able to practice law.
There's a set of guidelines that this committee is going to go through to determine, if he has rehabilitated, if he should be allowed to practice as a lawyer. What's the main consideration that will happen at this hearing today?
The main consideration will be how will the public feel about him practicing law.
Which is interesting because it was more than 30 submissions that forced this resignation in the first place.
Right. So we give people a second chance and sometimes third and fourth, and also to take into account that he is not permitted to appear in a courtroom. Any lawyer or any judge that resigns in Alberta or Ontario, regardless of how they resigned, if they want to practice law, they cannot appear in a courtroom or even in chambers at the judge's office because you don't want to give the appearance of bias. So
very difficult for them to there's all different kinds of law, but
right.
Very challenging for him to practice being in a courtroom.
Yeah, he will need special permission. He has indicated that he's only interested in practicing construction law. So construction law is really just paperwork, so he wouldn't need to appear in court.
Has this happened historically before, where we see a judge who has resigned in disgrace reapply to become a lawyer and win?
Yes, but not to this extent. So Mr. Camp now, he went through 2 stages. So the first stage was a preliminary inquiry with 5 people who said, you should resign. He said no. So then it went to the second stage where there was around 23 people that said you should resign, and he said no. And then when it was the motion was going to be passed, Parliament, then he said, okay, fine, I'll resign. The 2 other situations where it happened, it just went to the first stage. So one example is a judge a few years ago where her husband posted nude photos of her on a pornography website and invited his former client, her husband was a lawyer, so he invited his former client to engage in the threesome. And she was told that if this proceeded further, she would be asked to resign. So she just resigned not too shortly after those proceedings commenced. And the second example was in Ontario this very summer. The former judge, he had a cottage on the First Nations land, and there was a First Nations land claim, and then he wrote letters of recommendation to demonstrate why the First Nations didn't have a viable claim. And it was said by the Canadian Judicial Council what he did would probably result in them asking him to resign. So he just resigned, and now he's an arbitrator. An arbitrator deals with private disputes and makes decisions in a private capacity as a judge.
Will you, as somebody in the legal profession, be surprised, or what will your feelings be like if he is reinstated to practice law?
Everybody deserves a second or third chance. I would not feel comfortable as a lawyer if he were permitted to practice law in a criminal setting. If it's construction law, which has nothing to do with what he said, then I'm perfectly fine with that.
Good to have you here. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you for having me.
All right, coming up after the break, we're going to take a closer look at the power struggle inside the Saudi kingdom.